A few months ago, Rasheed Griffith, a longtime China Talk listener, reached out to me and said he was interested in starting his own show. Fast forward to today, and the China and the Caribbean podcast has 5 shows already. In this episode, Rasheed and I talk about the Caribbean and Huawei, open source tech, the CCP's Twitter bots, what Chinese TV shows we're watching, and why I like Chinese hip-hop. Lastly, I thought him starting his show was just the coolest thing ever and would love for this to happen more. As an incentive for you to start your own China-adjacent podcast, if you produce at least 5 quality episodes, I'll be open to running one of your shows on my channel to help you get some visibility.
Hi everyone, welcome to the China and the Caribbean podcast about the growing economic, social, and political relations between China and the Caribbean. Today we're talking with Jordan Schneider, the host of China Talk podcast, who actually is the primary motivation for this entire podcast.
This is you're my most prized offspring.
So one of the things that you talk a lot about is China-US tech. And in the Caribbean, that actually is a big deal because obviously a lot of tech that we use in the Caribbean is obviously from the US, but a lot of our basic infrastructure now is actually Huawei built. And I believe on a former episode of yours, you had Emily to talk about 5G and Huawei and tech. And she actually was invited by the US Embassy of the Eastern Caribbean a few weeks ago to have a similar conversation as well.
Oh, very cool.
From your perspective, how do you see the current troubles between the US and China as it pertains to tech? How do you see that playing out over the next few years?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Rasheed. And hats off to your incredible intro music. So what you've seen over the past, starting at the end of the Obama administration, but going through the Trump administration, has been a growing sort of wariness on the part of the U.S. government about the rise of China's technology. And part of that is just due to China's success in building globally competitive products and getting nearer and nearer to the cutting edge on a lot of different things that could threaten the U.S. commercially as well as potentially militarily, as many of these technologies have dual-use applications when it comes to building better airplanes and chips that go inside warfighting algorithms or what have you. So coming back to your initial setup of Huawei and 5G, one of the other big things that the Trump administration has pushed largely successfully is to convince many of the U.S. allies that having Huawei in their 5G networks is dangerous. The thesis being that if you have Chinese technology, then Huawei is subject to the Chinese government's whim, and say there's a trade war, Huawei could be forced to shut off connectivity or make it much easier to spy on lots and lots of citizens. The argument that the Trump administration pushed forth was successfully convinced many of America's closest allies, including Australia, Japan, the UK, it seems like Germany, France, and many others. So the question then is, what will countries that aren't like big targets of potential sort of like recriminations from China and are not as wealthy as the likes of the UK or Japan do when it comes to this question? So I had a guest on, I think earlier last year, talk about the decision tree of which countries should and shouldn't end up spending the money to keep Huawei out of their telecom system. And the conclusion that he came to, which I largely agree with, is if you're the likes of Barbados and to be honest, like China isn't going to be invading Barbados anytime soon or starting a trade war anytime soon, it's unlikely that the kind of risk that comes with Huawei, be that from a sort of surveillance perspective or a future economic leverage perspective, is worth the tens of billions of dollars, which you would end up being able to save by going with Huawei. We've seen third countries be faced with a lot of pressure, like for instance what you saw with Australia in the past few weeks. But I was listening to your show earlier this morning where you talked about how Beijing business people, when asked, are you interested in exporting to China, they'd be like, it's too far away, I don't want to deal with it. So I think at the end of the day, the chances of China like putting big exports restrictions on Barbados is really low. And you're probably in a better place to answer than I am of whether or not that's a big potential concern.
Yeah, it's definitely not a concern at all. And that's one of the interesting points to note, is because a lot of the conversation about the tech clash between the US and China obviously is framed between the US and China. But in terms of like Caribbean countries, the actual calculation is very different. It's a non-starter question to even consider changing telecom infrastructure. It's just not possible.
Yeah, there was a quote coming out of the State Department, I think, where I think Pompeo said, like, every diplomat all around the world should be focused on China. And you do the China and the Caribbean podcast. Like, clearly there are things that are important about that relationship. But I think there are many other things in the U.S. Caribbean relationship which are more important than whether or not Huawei is going to be helping build out connecting Barbados to 5G.
Yeah, exactly. Also, one other thing, in the Caribbean, 5G actually makes very little sense. And that's also a thing, I think a lot of the conversation kind of talking about 5G in the Caribbean, it glossed over that fact. Where, for example, let's say Barbados has about 300,000 people. There's no need for any extra bandwidth. Jamaica has about 3 million. Even in that case, you don't need any extra bandwidth either. But it's still a very topical thing. Sure. Yeah. So you also had a piece in Wired with Kevin proposing that a good strategy towards actually competing with China as a software is actually open source as the bedrock of your strategy. So why do you think that's actually a good way forward?
Sure. So I think in general, the kind of principles of open source are minimal to American values. The sort of like China state-driven industrial model involves spending a lot of money on picking a handful of national champions and hoping they take you out into the promised land. One of the sort of magical things about open source, and just for a few minutes of background for folks who haven't come across it, is basically it's a sort of development philosophy which was started in the 80s and early 90s, and it started around software. If folks have heard of GitHub Linux, that was created by people all around the world sending stuff, working together and without compensation, and kind of committing their different changes to a sort of broader stream of other folks working on it, and ending up with this magical thing, which is first-rate technology and open for the whole world to use. So it's not just Linux. Like, there are many other examples of software which is now central to the things we use on a daily basis. And this website called GitHub, which is where most of the open source software lives, is absolutely, the software that lives on GitHub is absolutely critical to things that you interact with dozens of times a day, on and offline. There's a big discussion in the US about what to do about industrial policy. And this is something that conservatives in particular have shied away from for a long time, given that they are worried about picking winners and losers and having, it sounds socialist, giving subsidies to industries. And there's also been a lot of blowback in 2008, 2009 with the stimulus after the great financial crisis, where Republicans were all angry that Obama gave money to Solyndra, though he also gave money to Tesla, and here we are today. But anyways, helping push forward open source technology is a bit of a way around that, in that you end up boosting the building blocks that future companies will need, while not necessarily putting all of your eggs in one basket. If the government puts more support into it, could end up having more broad benefits to an entire industry, as opposed to maybe if you give checks to 10 companies, if they all die, then all the money goes with it. But if you invest in the open source technology that future companies will need to build on, that's a sort of like a more sustainable solution and has a broader societal impact. Interestingly, the Chinese government has caught on to this logic to a certain degree as well. And there are parts of the Chinese bureaucracy which are very excited about the potential for open source hardware and software, because they see it as a way to potentially get around U.S. export sanctions, like we were talking about in your first question, Rasheed. The logic being, okay, if all this code is just up online on the internet, then you can't stop us from getting it. It's not like a corporate secret or something. If all you want to think of whether or not you want to embrace open source from a U.S.-China competitive aspect, there are potential downsides, but I think pushing more open models helps counteract the support that Chinese state-owned enterprises, as well as just like companies that have like a walled garden where they can grow and perfect and build a base market of 1 billion people. It allows other firms outside of that universe to develop in a more healthy way without necessarily having to do the same thing that China is, which is picking a handful of state champions and rolling the dice that those firms are going to be run well enough to go head to head with the companies that China is supporting.
Mm-hmm. In terms of strategy, industrial strategy, and so forth, the U.S. election is fairly finished, and the incoming administration, they obviously have to have some kind of policy regarding all these kind of things. Do you think that the Biden administration will actually have a better China policy than Trump administration in a more robust way?
So first off, I think there's going to be a continued focus on technology, a new focus on human rights, and a decreased focus on trade. So first on technology, I've spent a lot of time reading the China-related writings of all these people who have just been appointed to important jobs in the Obama administration. And basically, almost all of them agree with the thesis that the Trump put forward, which is that China's technological rise is an issue and something we need to address. While the way that I think a Biden administration is going to go about addressing it will be a little different than the Trump administration. I'm not entirely sure to what extent they're going to continue taking the kind of like export restrictions and sanctions on Chinese firms if they're going to continue down the path that Trump has of being pretty aggressive in targeting lots of different actors and banning American firms from selling chips to various Chinese ones and so on. I am confident. Their whole phrase was Build Back Better. And they put out a very large policy document with these enormous total $100 billion totals for investing in science and technology and research in a handful of other things that they hope to not only have a negative technology policy of stopping China from growing and getting to the cutting edge, but also ensuring that the U.S. continues its place in global preeminence and doing that through a variety of various policy measures. The most important question, I think, which is still outstanding, is to what extent the GOP is going to be open to spending money on these sorts of issues. So this is the sort of traditional swing in GOP politics is when there's a Republican president, they don't really care about deficits and are happy to cut taxes and not really worrying about spending more than comes in. But once the Democrats take back the White House, all of a sudden Republicans in Congress are saying, oh, wait, we're fiscal conservatives. We're worried about the national debt and so on. There's going to be things pulling on both sides with them when it comes to these sorts of issues. On the one hand, some of them are going to regain their sort of like fiscal consciousness, while others are going to say, oh, like science is anti-China, we're fine with it, we're happy to dabble in more industrial policy type stuff if the point is to make sure that we don't lose our edge to China. So that's going to be something that's going to be fascinating to watch unfold, and will unfold pretty early on, I think, in the first few months of a Biden administration.
Another thing you wrote about not too long ago was the extent of China's Twitter operations for influence.
Oh, that was a fun one, yeah.
Why do you think that the influence operations on social media from China are still so lackluster?
So, to give a little bit of background on the report I did, Twitter put out a large sample of all of the accounts that they took down, which they assessed to be part of what they call inauthentic influence operations, basically making fake accounts. So this is not the Chinese embassy in Barbados saying, hey, look at all the things you can buy from China. This is basically the equivalent of like Twitter bots, mostly talking about Hong Kong and Taiwan elections and Guo Wengui and what have you. Your question, like, why are they so bad at this? I think there are a handful of reasons. First off, it's like a talent problem. These jobs presumably do not pay particularly well. And the folks who have strong English language or foreign language skills are probably wealthy enough. And again, it's not just language skills you need to do this. You also need to like actually understand the culture and like the way foreigners use social media, which is hard and requires not just being able to pass your English language Gaokao exam, but like to have basically obsessively been watching American television and hanging out on Twitter for fun and what have you. So that type of person is not going to take this job, which is basically like sweatshop work of like when your KPI is just like making 10,000 tweets a day. 98% of the tweets that they caught had 0 likes. So just to give you a sense of like how much this is a rote operation. So anyways, first off, we have just talent not necessarily being there. Second off, the accounts clearly did not have like sort of freedom to be creative. And the counterexample to this is what Russia has been able to do. When you look at the Russian accounts that Twitter took down, they are funny, they are very up to the minute, they say whatever they want, and it shows in their results. Like they commonly have tweets that go super viral and have like tens of thousands of likes. And looking at them, like all those likes aren't fake, right? But it's something that which is reflective of domestic state media. Is at the end of the day, Chinese influence operations, they don't allow like a lot of freedom at the endpoint, whether that be an ambassador or state media. Like if you watch CCTV5, the English language CCTV, and compare that to GT, which is the sort of Russian equivalent, it's clear that English language CCTV is just very hidebound, and they have talking points that come down and they have to repeat them and aren't allowed to like riff off of it and adapt it to an audience. Lastly, I think the product that these influence operations are trying to sell is much less exciting than what the CCP was able to proffer back at its height of influence around the world in the 50s and 60s. In one of your earlier episodes, you mentioned in the early 1960s, the former president of Guyana went to China and hung out with Mao to learn about the revolution and understand what was happening. And that's because what was happening in China, if you were a left-wing leader, was incredible. Here was a proletarian revolution. Here was this revolutionary leader who'd kicked out the imperialists and was leading the world into a new era. And the appeal of Maoism as an ideology was something which was extraordinarily powerful in not just developing world countries, but also in the US and in Europe. The Black Panthers in the US were big fans of Mao. Same with a lot of communist movements in France and the UK. So nowadays, like, what is Xi Jinping selling? This sort of like communist, but not really communist anymore, more just like authoritarian model where I guess the biggest thing which would be exciting would be to like help you find a development model to get richer faster. And that doesn't quite have the sort of appeal that the CCP had in its earlier years in the 30s, 50s and 60s in particular.
I agree. To kind of change gear a bit, a few years ago in Barbados and Trinidad and some other Caribbean countries, K-dramas became a bit popular. Not very popular, but a bit popular. Okay. And I always wonder, like back then, I was like, why are there no Chinese or Japanese shows on TV? And now I understand these things more. Chinese shows are actually not very good. Still. Are there any Chinese show recommendations that you have?
Absolutely. First off, I would not argue with the fact that into the 2000s and early 2010s, the quality hasn't quite reached the levels of HBO, like Netflix, back when Netflix made good television, and so on. So I do watch a lot of Chinese television, and both for just to keep my Mandarin up, but also out of entertainment purposes. And there are two types of shows which I watch. So the first is like Zongi Jiemu, which is like reality show. And I'll tell you about one which I was watching the other day, which is so incredibly cringeworthy, but also just incredible. So it's called 令人心动 offer, which is an internship competition. So it's just, I don't know why these kids sign up, but it's like very highly educated Chinese from 23 to 28. And the first 2 seasons are in law firms, presumably because it's straightforward if you're just a random person to understand what a lawyer does as opposed to an engineering competition or something. And all these folks are like varying levels of mature, and watching them interact with bosses and screw up is just so cringeworthy because I know I've made the same exact mistakes they made 10 years ago. Another fascinating thing about that show is particularly how a lot of dynamics of workplace life in China are realized in the show. So you see all this sort of actually not particularly subtle misogyny, as well as slightly more subtle class discrimination, particularly on on where people went to university. So there's a very clear hierarchy in the show where the guy who has an LLM from Stanford gets way more respect at first than the person who was at the Wuhan government university or whatever, when everyone's, oh, you didn't go to a fancy school, like, why are you even auditioning for this show? Which just made me very uncomfortable. And in terms of the sort of gender stuff, watching them ask the women about what are you going to do? Like, when are you planning to have a child? Questions that are straight up illegal in the US, seeing that be something that these partners at law firms are comfortable asking to someone in an interview that is going to be broadcast to millions of people is really says something, I think, about the nature of the Chinese workplace. So that's one for you. 令人心动 offer. I particularly the first few episodes of season 2. And coming back to 电视剧, which is like scripted drama. My favorite one of 2020, which I think shows a next level of sort of skill and acting and writing in particular, is this show 隐秘的角落. It's called like The Secret Corner on YouTube. You can find it in English subtitles. And it's this 12-part miniseries. It's interesting. One of the writers slash producers went to Columbia University and got his writing professor involved, and there are lots of sort of little tricks that it's very clear comes from Western miniseries. So like cliffhangers at the end of the episode to get you to keep watching, and it also portrays a different segment of Chinese society, which is so most Chinese shows focus on like basically very rich people, but this one, the central characters are middle and lower class, which I think adds a lot to the show, and making it not just like another, like I'm gonna drive around in Beijing in my Ferrari and complain that like my parents aren't nice to me or whatever. So those two I would shout out.
I recently watching 猎户, and this one it started off very good. It's about it's the most odd topic for a TV show. The English is called Hunting, and it's about the anti-corruption operation between the financial system in the early 2000s in China, when they hunt down financial criminals and how they create the financial crime division in Beijing, and the drama that unfolds. But it was again one of those, like, it made like 40 some hours or so. It started pretty good, but tapered off. I was like, come on.
Yeah. Oh, one more for you guys. This is a newer one that just came out in October. It's called Chiun. So it's like Weiqi de Qi and like 灵魂的魂. And it's this show about this like kid, and he plays Go, and he has a secret guardian, and it's just acted and fun. And I played a little bit of Go at the beginning of quarantine, and it now got me back into it because I'm like, oh man, like I wish I had a fairy godfather telling me what the good moves are and like making me a global champion or whatever. So anyway, shout out to that one too. Good child acting.
Yeah. A lot of books now about China foreign policy, China relations, China econ, China politics go down the line. And I usually, personally, don't find many of these books very good. But I'm sure you must have some good recommendations about some China Washington books that would be very useful to read.
So what I'm going to do is not recommend a book in particular, but recommend a website. Because I feel like all the good China books I read end up becoming China Talk podcast episodes. So you can just go back into my archive and see. But there's this website called the American Mandarin Society, which is run by this guy, Nate Ahern's. One of the things that they've done over the past few years is get experts in particular fields to write syllabi, like 8 or 10 week syllabi, to get folks from 0 to 1 on a variety of topics. So the ones that they have currently now on their website, mandarinsociety.org, are on military, the politics and party, the economy, Chinese foreign policy, environment and energy. And I think the best tip I have, and the thing that I've realized, is the more basic understanding you read, the more you can get out of books faster. So in so many China books, there's a lot of explanation which is repeated from book to book, because these books have to be able to be understood by people who aren't China experts if you're writing in English. And books are usually about like China and a topic, and like they want the people who are interested in the topic to also read the book. And I think if you read through one of those syllabi and then you start reading books, you can end up skipping a third of it and skimming a lot more of these books and just being able to ingest a lot more quickly in the latest literature if you have built a really solid foundation of knowledge about, say, the party or the Chinese economy. And for doing that, the most efficient way, there are books like the Handbook to Chinese Economy or whatever, but I found that the best way to do that on particular topics, I'm reading through the Chinese military one right now, which I've found fascinating, is to go down and be rigorous about reading every article on these China Syllabi projects. So a bit of a meta recommendation, but ultimately I think one more useful than any particular book.
Agree, for sure. One of the things that people have been sleeping on in the West, I think, is Chinese rap. You're like single-handedly trying to drag us into it one ultra at a time. So why exactly do you like Chinese rap so much?
I mean, why do I like Chinese rap? I think I like rap. And maybe the more germane question is like, why does this like white guy from New York City only listen to one genre? And I will say that there is a long and storied history of white Jews from New York City being involved in the rap industry. So I guess like it was from baseline moving to China already being obsessed with this genre and like being so excited that it existed in China. I will confess that like even now I still find many of the lyrics very difficult to follow. The sort of pronunciation is hard, but watching this thing that I love and which is extraordinarily professionalized in the US, seeing it over the past few years in China go from something where it was basically impossible to make a living and everyone was doing it basically as a hobby and because something they loved, and watching sort of money come in, which both has increased the time that the artist can devote to the sort of like level of production of the songs. So seeing that sort of historic arc replay itself, but like way faster in China, because it was all of a sudden in 2017 with China Has Hip Hop, where this became this genre was brought to the public consciousness, and all of a sudden these rappers who were in near poverty were able to do shows in front of a few thousand people and really sustain themselves. I think the music some of it is very good, much of it is not that good, but there's certainly enough to find one interesting song a week, which I can put on China Talk.
I would say because of China Talk, I think now my playlist every once in a while you see from Ma Siwei or Xiaobai just like pop in every once in a while.
That's great to hear.
Okay.
I'm definitely going to throw some more Caribbean stuff on my show.
Actually, okay. Thank you so much, Jordan, for having this conversation. It was really fun.
Rasheed, this is